Hello and welcome to this session called SAM in the Cloud. My name's Louise Ulrich and it's my pleasure to take you through this training. We're going to look at a checklist of 10 things in this session that can be used as organisations move to the cloud to ensure that they stay compliant. But you may be wondering a little about this. Does the need for SAM, or software asset management, go away as organisations go to the cloud, since it's all about subscription licenses and using and paying for services on a consumption basis? What can possibly go wrong? Well, that's what we'll look at in this session. So let's get started with that checklist and see some of the things it's worth watching out for. First item on the checklist is this. Do you have the correct underlying licenses in place for your subscription licenses? And this is important since some subscription licenses are add-on licenses. And actually, even though you've bought the subscription licenses, you're not compliant if you haven't got the required underlying licenses. Let's take a look at a couple of examples of this. You may have heard of the add-on user subscription licenses for Office 365, and here I've taken the one for E3. It gives a named user access to the Office 365 E3 services, but a user is only accessing those services in a compliant manner if they are also licensed with the underlying licenses, which in this case are Office Professional Plus 2016 and the Core or Enterprise CAL Suite, both with active software assurance. It's important to make sure that there are processes in place to link the add-on user SLs with their underlying device or user licenses, and to be aware that if the software assurance lapses, the add-on user SLs are not compliant. Let's take another example on the server side this time, and I've chosen the Premium Assurance add-on subscription license. This adds 6 additional years of product support beyond the end of extended support for SQL Server or Windows Server, or both of course if required. Again, the words add-on in the license name indicate that there are underlying licenses required, and this time there are 2 requirements. There must be active SA on the underlying SQL and or Windows Server licenses, and the whole estate must be covered with these Premium Assurance add-ons. From a SAM perspective, it's important to be able to link the add-on SLs with the underlying licenses, and also to ensure that there are processes in place so that if additional SQL or Windows Server licenses are added, further Premium Assurance add-on SLs are also purchased. So when add-on subscription licenses are purchased, it's important to make sure that underlying licenses are also in place. However, there's one more thing to consider here, since some subscription licenses are not described as add-on licenses, but they still require underlying licenses. Let's take a look at an example of that. The example I've chosen here are Windows 10 Enterprise user subscription licenses. Now, the E3 and the E5 licenses both require a qualifying operating system license, which means that the operating system may only be installed locally on a device which is already licensed with a Windows 7, 8.1 or 10 Pro or Enterprise license. Many user subscription licenses separate the use of the software from a particular device. This is not the case with Windows 10 USLs. And you can appreciate from a process point of view, it's important to make sure that every device that a user installs the software on has got a qualifying operating system. The second point on our checklist, do you meet the eligibility criteria for the subscription licenses you have? Since some user subscription licenses are at special price points, only for eligible customers, and if you don't meet the eligibility criteria, you find yourself in a non-compliant situation. Let's take a look at some examples for this as well. I've got a couple of examples to talk through on this slide. Let's start with an example of a From SA user subscription license. And you can see here I've chosen the Secure Productive Enterprise one. This gives a user access to all of the Secure Productive Enterprise services, and it's targeted at those organisations who have used traditional on-premises software and now want to move to the cloud. However, to be eligible for these specially priced From SA licenses, a customer must have paid for desktop platform licenses for 3 years before they're eligible to move to Secure Productive Enterprise using the From SA license. Just as a note, the desktop platform is Office, Windows, and either the Core or Enterprise CAL suite. And also, the software assurance must still be active on these licenses as well. The next example is around the tiered pricing for Dynamics 365. Now, tiered pricing means that the more licenses you buy, the cheaper the price. And this tiered pricing is available for the Customer Engagement Plan, USLs. There are 5 tiers of pricing, and each tier is transacted with an individual SKU appropriate for the number of USLs that are being acquired. Tier 2 pricing, as an example, is for customers who purchase 100 or more licenses. And thus, if a customer had just 27 licenses, but they had been transacted with the Tier 2 SKU, then they wouldn't be compliant. So it's worth checking with these special priced licenses what the eligibility rules are. The next item on our checklist is the notion of use rights. And have you assumed that the use rights will be the same for subscription licenses purchased through different channels? The reality is that the same USL can convey different use rights dependent on how it was purchased through a traditional volume licensing program or through newer programs such as the Cloud Solution Provider program, for example. Again, let's take a look at a particular example to illustrate this. I've taken the Windows 10 Enterprise E3 and E5 user subscription licenses again here, and we'll start by looking at the use rights granted with these licenses when they're acquired through an enterprise agreement. You can see that you're allowed to install the software as many times as you like, obeying the qualifying operating system rules that we looked at earlier, of course, and you can choose to deploy earlier versions of the software if you want to. You have a choice of servicing branches so that you can control how often you receive feature updates, and there's deployment flexibility as well. You can choose to install the operating system locally on a device or use it in a virtual desktop infrastructure. However, within the Cloud Solution Provider program, a license of exactly the same name is sold, but the use rights are rather different. For example, you may only install the software on 5 devices and you can't make use of downgrade rights. You must keep the deployment up to date with either the current branch or current branch for business, and there are no rights for a virtual desktop infrastructure. Windows 10 Enterprise must be installed locally on a device. So here it's important to know how licenses were purchased to make sure that you have the use rights that you need and that you're not inadvertently assuming some use rights that in fact you don't have. Let's continue with use rights, but now consider this question. Have you assumed, as you move to the cloud, that the use rights are the same as the ones in a familiar on-premises deployment? Actually, the same product licensed in an on-premises data center and in Azure doesn't necessarily have the same licensing requirements. As usual, let's take a look. The example I've chosen here is Windows Server. Now, how does the licensing of this differ as we move to the cloud? Well, let's start with the familiar licensing of Windows Server on-premises. And here I've got a server running virtual machines, which is fully licensed. And within our environment, to allow users and devices to access the services of the server, I license the users or devices with CALs. However, when we start to run virtual machines in Azure, then I pay an all-inclusive fee for those virtual machines, and I don't need to have CALs for users or devices to access those virtual machines. Naturally, if I do have existing users and devices with CALs, as on the left-hand side, then of course they can access the Azure virtual machines as well. So there are a couple of things to watch out for here. As we move to the cloud in this instance, the licensing terms are more favourable. But in a hybrid environment, I'm going to need to make sure that there are processes in place to track which users access which Windows Server virtual machines and that they do have the right licenses assigned to them. Let's continue to consider some things to watch for as you move from an on-premises infrastructure to the cloud. And the first to look at is whether your subscription licenses give access to on-premises servers, since some USLs do indeed allow access to equivalent on-premises servers. As usual, let's take an example. What we're talking about here is something called dual access rights, and I specifically want to consider some of the Office 365 plans. In particular, the Office 365 Enterprise plans, so that's E1, E3 and E5, and the plans aimed at smaller businesses, so Office 365 Business Essentials and Business Premium. Here we have the Office 365 services in the cloud, and the users on the left licensed with Office 365 Enterprise licenses, and those on the right with Office 365 Business licenses both have access to the cloud services, as indeed we would expect. However, here's a server within the business. It's fully licensed for SharePoint, Skype for Business and Exchange server, and the users who are licensed with the Office 365 Enterprise licenses also have access to those on-premises servers, but on the right-hand side, those with business licenses don't. So it's always worth checking whether subscription licenses give dual access rights to on-premises servers. Not all licenses do, but if you're moving from an on-premises environment to the cloud, these rights can be useful as you transition, or even if you need to maintain a hybrid infrastructure going forward. Just looked at whether a subscription license gives access to an on-premises server, and the next topic we're going to consider is whether those subscription licenses allow the installation of on-premises server software. And unusual as this perhaps sounds, some USLs do indeed allow the installation of on-premises server software. As usual, let's move on to a couple of examples. The first USL I want to take is the Dynamics 365 Customer Engagement Plan USL. This gives rights to install the Dynamics 365 on-premises server product as many times as required in physical or virtual infrastructures on any servers used by the customer. This could include servers owned by service providers which are shared by several customers. And the USLs may be purchased through any program, so an enterprise agreement or the cloud solution provider program, for example. So buying these USLs means that an organization has complete deployment flexibility. Users may access the Dynamics 365 online services, but it's also possible to set up an on-premises infrastructure, and the users are licensed to access that as well. The second example I've chosen here are the Secure Productive Enterprise E3 and E5 USLs. These USLs also give rights to install on-premises software, and this time it's Exchange, Skype for Business and SharePoint server. Again, customers can install these products as many times as they like, but there are some restrictions on which servers may be used, and you can see that the rules state that the server must be dedicated to a customer. That could be an on-premises server or indeed one managed by a service provider. There are also some restrictions on how the USLs are purchased if these rights are needed. They must be purchased through an enterprise agreement. So of course that means that if an organisation has purchased these USLs through the Cloud Solution Provider Programme, then they may not install the on-premises server software. We saw, in fact, didn't we, at checkpoint number 3, that it's worth watching out for different use rights for subscription licenses acquired through different programmes. Checkpoint item number 7 is this. It's worth seeing if your on-premises server license give any rights in the cloud. Some licenses do, and this is the idea of extended use rights. The example I'll take for this section is Windows Server again, and if there is active software assurance on the traditional Windows Server licenses, then an organisation can take advantage of something called the Azure Hybrid Use benefit. Let's have a look at that in action. Now, here you can see 3 on-premises servers, all licensed with Windows Server licenses with active software assurance. Windows Server 2016 is licensed with core licenses, which is what the little numbers mean on the yellow licenses. That's the number of core licenses required. The rules state that you need a minimum of 8 core licenses for each processor and the whole server must be covered, which is why there are 16 core licenses assigned to the two servers on the right, where the DC represents data center. The left-hand machine is licensed with Standard Edition, and if you license the physical server, then you're allowed to run 2 virtual machines. To run another 2 virtual machines, you need to assign the same number of licenses again, and that's why there are 2 lots of 16 licenses on that server. The data center licenses allow an unlimited number of virtual machines to run. The Azure Hybrid Use benefit allows an organization to choose where they use their Windows Server licenses. So on the first machine, 2 virtual machines are moved to Azure, and the license may be reassigned to Azure to license Windows Server running on those virtual machines. Now, Windows Server standard licenses are said to have alternative rights. You can choose whether to use the licenses for an on-premises server or for Azure. However, the rules are different with the Data Center Edition, and the Azure Hybrid Use benefit rights are said to be additive, which means that these 2 virtual machines can move to Azure, and they're considered to be licensed by the existing licenses which stay assigned to the on-premises servers. Now, you may be thinking, how many virtual machines can you run in Azure with the licenses we've got here? Let's imagine that this organization favors a type of Azure virtual machine with 4 cores. The rules state that 8 core licenses need to be assigned to each of these virtual machines. So the 16 standard licenses do indeed cover those 2 virtual machines in Azure. We know that the data center licenses stay assigned to the on-premises servers and can cover an unlimited number of virtual machines running on those. But the additive rights mean that for the licenses you see here, the organization could also license 4 of the 4 core virtual machines in Azure. We have a total of 32 data center core licenses, and we would assign the minimum of 8 to each of the Azure virtual machines. So this is a great benefit for organizations to take advantage of, but as usual, there need to be some processes in place to ensure that all virtual machines in a server farm are appropriately licensed. The next topic to talk about is to check that you've deployed the correct software, since actually software associated with a subscription license may not be the same as the software associated with a traditional device license, and actually you wouldn't be compliant if you've installed the wrong software. Let's take a look. This is actually the case with Microsoft Office. Microsoft Office Professional Plus 2016 is downloaded from the volume licensing portals, and it's installed via MSI or Windows Installer technology. Whereas Office 365 Pro Plus is available to be installed from the Office 365 portal, and that's installed via Click to Run technology. From a user perspective, the products look and feel the same. They're the familiar Word, Excel and PowerPoint applications, but of course we know they're licensed in a different way. A device license for Office Professional Plus and a user license for Office 365 Pro Plus. And as I said, if your users are licensed with USLs and you use the traditional Office bits to install Office on their devices, then that's not a compliant position. Let's now move to a couple of things that your users may be inadvertently doing, which makes you non-compliant. For instance, are they sharing credentials? Microsoft user subscription licenses are named user licenses, and there's no scope for having a generic user ID which multiple people use simultaneously. Let's take an example of what could happen when credentials are shared. I've taken an Office 365 Pro Plus user subscription license here, and this is interesting in this context since it allows installations of the applications on up to 5 PCs. However, these installations are all for the use of the named user to whom the license has been assigned. So this user here on the left has the license assigned to him, and he may use Office on these devices. But when he thinks, aha, I'm only using 2 devices, I'll give my credentials to my friend or my mum so that they can use one of the installations on their PC, then the situation becomes non-compliant. So it's worth educating employees so that they certainly know the benefits they're entitled to, these multiple installations, but they also know the rules associated with them, that the installations are for them only, and it's not appropriate or legal to share their business credentials with other people to use a spare installation. Last checkpoint. Are your users licensed for consumer cloud apps? And well, what are the implications of this? In fact, not all user subscription licenses grant rights for commercial use. As usual, let's take a look at an example. Here I've taken the Office 365 Home or Personal plans. Now, users could already be licensed with one of these plans for their personal devices, and thus they have access to the Office applications. It's tempting to think that because they are licensed for these applications, that it's okay for them to bring their personal devices into the workplace and to use them with the Office applications to carry out their daily work. However, there are no commercial use rights granted with these licenses, and so this is again not a compliant position. So within a business, generally speaking, if you want your users to use cloud services for the purposes of that business, then you need to acquire licenses for them through the business. That concludes our SAM in the Cloud session, and here's a summary of the things to have on your checklist as you move to the cloud. We saw that you may need to get some processes in place so that underlying licenses are matched to subscription licenses or eligibility criteria can be confirmed. We also saw that you shouldn't assume any use rights for subscription licenses since they can be different between channels, but may also offer unexpected extras, such as access to on-premises servers or even the rights to install on-premises server software. And we finish with a couple of things from a user perspective, making sure that they know they must not share user credentials and must be licensed for business versions of applications if they'll be using them in their day-to-day work. I do hope you've enjoyed this session. Why not now take the associated short exam and get licensing ready to see if you've understood and remembered the key points about SAM in the cloud.